Hey everyone, we're about to get ready and get started with this panel discussion. If you'd like to take a closer seat up front, please do so. Of course, this is such an important topic. I was hoping that we would fill this whole room, but if you'd like to take a closer seat up front, we'd appreciate that. And thank you so much for sticking it out to this part of the discussion. And respect for everybody's time, I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to stick to the script. Because this is very important to me. These questions are very important, and I know it's just as important to you guys. That's why you're here today, right? So today we have me, Lyvesha Franklin. I am the moderator, and I am co-chair the lead counsel for the Coalition for Homeless Service Providers, and I'm also the CEO and founder of my own organization, Queens Council, building a Black birth network here in Monterey County. So I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Huerta. I'm an affordable housing consultant based here in Salinas, and one of my main clients is the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. I'm representing them today. Several other clients, notable interest for today too is people assisting the homeless based out of LA. I'm their director of Northern California, so I do a lot of permanent supportive housing, primarily in the San Jose area as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority. Currently, we serve 8 tribal nations, spanning nationwide services with the whole person trauma-informed approach.
Good afternoon. My name is Vicente Lara. I am the Health and All Policies Manager with the Monterey County Health Department with our Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Unit. And also currently on temporary reassignment with the Department of Emergency Management, taking the lead on the long-term recovery planning efforts in Bajaro.
All right, thank you all for joining us today and answering these very tough questions that everybody is looking forward to hearing. So like I said, I'm sticking to the script. Our panel description today is to explore the impact of historical policies on housing progress and systemic inequalities in this enlightening panel discussion. Join us as experts unravel the complex web of past decisions that have disadvantaged vulnerable communities and hindered our access to housing efforts. So our first question of the day is, to what extent do historical policies dating back several decades or more continue to shape the current landscape of housing progress and systemic inequalities in our communities? And could you provide specific examples of how these policies have had a lasting impact?
I'd love it if you started, because I think we should start from the very beginnings of this country a little bit.
So I think it's very important to start with that tribal nations have faced 173 years of housing insecurity at the hands of the state of California. January marks the month that the first governor of California issued a war of extermination on tribal communities. And at that time, out of state funds, they used $1 million to pay for that war of extermination. I think for not only our tribal communities, it's important to know that that first governor of California was a slave trader, and his intent was to never have Black or Indigenous communities exist here. To add on to that, the federal government recognized tribal nations' ability to have housing authorities in 1961. California didn't catch up until 2019. So we have some work to do. I want to shout out UCSF and Benioff and that study we just heard. But what we missed was there was 110 nations not consulted in that study. That's 110 tribal nations. Out of that, with the numbers we've pulled on our own, that's 36,000 tribal individuals that don't have solutions or policies attached to what goes forward.
So I get chills when I hear about just, kind of where we started, right? And I know many of us, even in the housing space, don't hear that enough too, right? We go right to, okay, how are we gonna house the folks that are on the waiting list, the next development that's happening, getting entitlements here and there, funding for this, that, and the other. So I think it's super important that we start there. I really appreciate that a lot. In terms of, again, how we got here, we could do a whole day long, unfortunately, right, about how this country really made folks suffer in terms of the housing situation. Going back from, let's just take it about 100 years ago, when the national appraisal system was really set up around the just before the Great Depression. And then soon thereafter, what happened was that they essentially kicked off the redlining, program nationwide, essentially meeting that, putting essentially a science to exclusionary practices in every community. So including where we're sitting today, right? And so it's kind of hard to say, okay, well, this was bad over here, that's bad over here. The whole system was set up, just as was mentioned before, not for, BIPOC communities. So just knowing that that's the case, but what did that look like, right? How was that operationalized? And so one thing that there's a data point that kind of sticks out for me, because when I think about how this country really celebrates, meritocracy, being able to lift yourself up by your bootstraps. Hey, you should be able to make it here, right? And candidly, maybe we are better than other countries in that metric, right? That still continuously actively hold folks down. Maybe we're a little bit better, right? But one metric that kind of stands out to me is that between 1934 and 1968, 98% of all home mortgages went to white families. 98%. Think about the years that time period covers. That's like when our middle class was created. That's when most of the country was actually developed. Most of the infrastructure of this country that we know of today, right, that we can see and point to, the transit system, airline system, the commerce, big and small businesses that were created. So I just think that, yes, 1968 happened, and we have the Housing Act, and we have several other acts after that, but enforcement of those policies and protections still continue to be problematic, right? Seems like every year this past year, there was dozens and dozens of bills that needed to be passed just to continue to fill some of those gaps, and yet there's still a lot more gaps to be filled. So I'll just leave it at that for a second.
And I think the one thing I do want to add is, I think it's important to recognize the history. It's important to recognize the past practices that, as Matt was talking about, were sanctioned by local jurisdictions, right? Local county and city jurisdictions, even the federal government at that time. And so, when we're thinking about solutions to housing and the challenges that we face today, I think the one thing that's just important to recognize is that we didn't just wake up this morning and these issues were here. There's been a long process that has led up to this point. And so when we start thinking about solutions and we start thinking about how we, resolve the housing crisis that we're in, we have to acknowledge that history. I think that history has to be present as we think about how we're going to move forward. One example of that is something that we're doing at the county. I'm going to call out my colleague here, Melanie Beretti, who's with the Housing and Community Development. So the state of California is requiring that all jurisdictions look at their titles, their housing deeds on record. And what the state is saying is that we have to identify those housing deeds that have restricted language in it. And when I talk about restricted language, I'm talking about language in deeds that say you cannot sell this property to BIPOC residents. It can only be sold to folks who fit this specific race and ethnic background. And so we still have deeds on file that have that language in it. We're going through that process right now with our assessor's office to identify those deeds. And there's no requirement for us to kind of really put that information out into the public sphere, but we feel like it's our responsibility to do so. Marin County actually has a really great example of how they've done it. So if folks want to just Google the Marin County Restricted Covenant Project, they have a bunch of really interesting GIS data sets that folks can kind of look at and explore. And you basically are able to kind of see where the concentration of these restricted deeds are. And it's really important because, as Matt was talking about redlining, we have seen redline, there are these redlining maps. Most of those maps are for like larger cities like San Jose, Oakland, Chicago, Baltimore. And the reason is because, those maps and that policy were implemented in cities that had a population over 100,000 or more at that time. And there wasn't a city here in Monterey County that met that threshold. And so the restricted covenants in the housing deed was basically a way that folks were implementing kind of redlining on the local level. And so being able to identify and kind of say, and I'll say this, we've seen, this isn't just like in a specific area in the county. This practice was everywhere in the county, from South County to the Peninsula to North County. We had an intern in the health department who was actually going through these old advertisement ads for these new housing developments. And in those ads, it said, things like, we are a restricted community. So they weren't even like trying to, it was blatant. It was just like upfront, and we've been able to find advertisements that, for housing developments in King City, in Moss Landing, there was another one in the Peninsula. So again, it was widespread. And again, my point is, we can't, I think it's just as important to think about future solutions as it is to recognize the historical context that really that laid the foundation for the issues that we're dealing with today.
Hi, and I'm so glad that you said that, like those words were intentional, to be to keep out the BIPOC community. So we have to be intentional about reconstruction, right? So yes, so we're going to go on to question 2, which says, how can policymakers and community leaders incorporate historical context into their decision-making processes to ensure that future housing initiatives are more equitable and inclusive, and what steps can be taken to avoid perpetuating past mistakes?
This one's a little hard for us. We just had a housing bill on the governor's desk, SB 18. That is the first restorative tribal housing bill to come across his desk since we were allowed to participate in this arena since 2019. And he vetoed it because he said he gave us home key and HHAP. It's like, man, brother, you worked so hard on that, real hard, huh? And so it's very difficult to even call out what to do on a policy level because tribal communities are still othered. We're not defined in these legislations because we're sovereign nations within a nation. We're not even a thought. You see these data sets that Asian, Black, everything else, and we're not in there. So I don't have a solution for that. I'll go back to the age-old, make sure everybody's at the table. There's not a place in California that there isn't a federally or non-federally recognized tribe. So if you don't see Indigenous people represented, there's a problem.
Thank you. So, Yeah, I mean, in terms of what we can do now, there's the 3 Ps strategy that kind of gets repeated a lot in the Bay Area. We use that here sometimes, but generally, production is the first P, where we need to have more housing, flat out. But housing that meets the needs of the folks in our communities. So not just any housing, not just the hundreds and maybe thousands of higher end luxury housing that we tend to see more of, above moderate, but we truly need more of the lower income, even ELI, extremely low income housing, right? That's what we're here today to talk about, is how we can get more supply that meets the needs of folks that are facing potential homelessness, right? And part of that is keeping the folks that have housing, even if it's potentially substandard, at least they are sheltered, right? There's levels to this. So it's necessary to think about what kind of protections can we continue to support and enforce in terms of keeping, again, those that are housed, and that is probably the primary homelessness prevention, intervention that we can do. As was mentioned earlier by several speakers, it's not enough to have housing, particularly if you have folks that are coming out of homelessness with the acuity, right, with the needs that we were just learning about. It needs to come with social services, wraparound services, case management, so that folks can have sustainable housing when they do get those opportunities. And I'll just mention too that in terms of reforms and policies that could really start to chip away at some of the structural issues that we're locked into, there's a whole body of work called Prop 13 reform. And it's basically the fact that, when I was born, and I'll say, what does Tupac say? He says, I was born in this world, I didn't make it, right? It's like, I was born in 1978 and there was a revolution happening. Not the kind of revolution that, Zapatistas talk about. The revolution that says, hey, homeowners aren't going to pay our fair share of taxes anymore. And essentially, passing Prop 13 in 1978 felt really good, probably for a majority of the state, that said no, not on the backs of homeowners anymore. But what ended up happening was that it locked in the decades, right? The 100 years that we were talking about of inequality that had happened up to that point got locked in, because then you have folks that are disincentivized to move because they pay 1%. Most homeowners in California pay 1% maximum, taxes, right? And it can change up to 2% when they sell. And that's still good. Raise your hand if you're a renter and your last, tell me what, 1%, 2%, the last time you got an increase in your rent, was it capped at 1% or 2%? Homeowners have gotten that, and I raised my hand. I was a homeowner for a while and a renter now, but benefit from that, right? And so somewhere along the line, and I would draw that line in 1978, is when things really got sideways with how things work. And actually, the year after, there's another data point, and I'll shift this over to my colleague here. But the other thing, a data point that was interesting, is that we're not just talking about housing. It's the whole tax structure, and how we planned our communities was dramatically changed in that minute, because what happened was that then local governments had to go to other sources, right? They had to go to the strip malls, and they had to go to selling used car sales. And you look at most of our communities, and there's a used car sales lot on the edge of almost every community. There's a reason for that. It's because of Prop 13, right? And the year after, 1979, the state lost about 60% of its taxing revenue to support things like public education. And the courts and other things suffered because of that dramatic shift in taxation that happened. So if we're going to make some significant efforts, we'd have to look at looking at Prop 13 and the biggest thing, which didn't pass voters few years ago, but it was an effort to try to get the commercial property tax owners to pay their fair share because it was never meant to do that. Disneyland is still paying 1978 taxes. Is that right?
So I work for the health department, and I think traditionally, it's been kind of our environmental health department bureau that really focuses on the environmental health aspect of housing and code enforcement and things like that. Not to say that the health department hadn't worked on housing issues in the past, but during the pandemic, I think the connection between health and housing was magnified in a lot of ways. The county came out with the COVID-19 Desperate Impact Report during the pandemic, and one of the key data points that came out of there was that the areas and the zip codes in our county that had the highest lack of affordable housing also saw a higher rate of COVID transmission. And the connection there is, or the assumption is that folks in areas where there's a lack of affordable housing experienced other things such as like multiple families living in a unit, overcrowding, et cetera, et cetera. And so if somebody got COVID and you asked them to isolate, where? Right. You had one or two restrooms for for 3 or 4 families. I mean, it was impossible for a lot of folks. And so you had a higher transmission rate. And so I think now there's a realization, I think for a lot of folks, that housing isn't just kind of a community development issue or an economic development issue. There's also a health issue. And I think one of the major drivers for homelessness that I think a lot of folks would agree on is that there's a lack of affordable housing. And so I just raised that point because I think it's recognizing, in terms of solutions, recognizing that there has to be a multi-sector kind of coming together, right? This issue is really big, and we need a really big table of different players coming to that table, bringing their own expertise and coming up with interdisciplinary solutions, and thinking about the entire, I guess, environment, right? Like thinking about the community holistically. Because the other thing too is, for the going back to the redlining maps, the same thing, right? I think there was like a really famous study where like folks were looking at the redlining maps and looking at COVID transmission, and there was like a correlation with that. It's also just a reflection that the segregated communities, the restricted communities, also faced decades of lack of investment in resources as well. And so I don't think we could just talk about housing in isolation. Housing equals resources in a community, whether that's access to healthcare services, whether that's access to educational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So, I just want to raise that up and have us thinking maybe about how we kind of bring that more holistic thinking to the issue of housing here locally. And recognize that, with like the like indigenous folks here locally, not having I've been in some conversation with some of the indigenous leaders here locally, and housing is not just about housing, it's about community. It's about cultural preservation of folks here locally. So it's not just a built structure, for shelter. but it's also so much more as well, about somebody's identity, about culture, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. I just think it's important to have us think about like that in the broader scheme of things.
Yeah, you said some key, that holistic approach to housing that's definitely necessary. It's a human issue.
Can I just for a quick minute before I forget, because I forget stuff. I got a lot of dad stuff in my head. But something you just said tied a lot together for me too around the redlining maps. There's so many different things that we can learn from that. One of the big things that you mentioned, you hit on, is this whole anti-displacement gentrification question, right? Because another study recently showed that when you look at the red line maps and you look at the places across the country that are the fastest gentrifying in terms of displacing people because of high costs and because of development that doesn't match the needs of the community, they match directly with the red line communities, right? Places like East San Jose and other places that are quickly gentrifying, families that have lived there for generations are having to move. And so that dramatically changes community, right? So there's a community preservation piece to this and a cultural preservation piece to how we solve our housing challenge that's also important. Thank you.
So you've all pretty much answered question 3. In what ways have vulnerable communities been disproportionately affected by past housing policies? So you've pretty much answered that. So we're going to go into question 4. Oh, yes, please go ahead. Yes.
I think it's key for all of our communities to call out what my colleagues have said, is that if we look at the data, we know that our zip code defines our health outcomes. And so if we look at our ACEs scores, the adverse childhood experiences, I'm a 9. My children are 8s. They're 6, 9, and 22. And just like my colleague said, in order to stabilize housing, it's not just about building more units. It's mitigating and healing that trauma and building community structures and having our public health partners in that space. Because I can send someone to the doctor 1,000 times, but until that doctor is separating that dollar and actually looking at that person, mom's going to go home and try and find any energy to clean the house or be present for her kids. And it's going to go back in that vicious cycle, exactly as it was set up to do. I look at my idol, Audre Lorde, who said the master's tools are never going to dismantle the master's house. And when we think about that, that's being the best us that we can be, whether that's a housing coordinator, a county supervisor, and thinking outside of that box. We may not get to take it apart, but we can go around it.
Uh-oh. I'm gonna have to ask you to define a little bit. Can you talk for a minute about the study that you were just saying, the trauma score? Because my ACE is my son's a 10, adopted son. I'm like a 1.5 or 2, and you said you're a 10. What does that mean?
That's the amount of trauma that you've experienced before the age of 18. I invite everybody to look at this study. It was done in the mid-1990s by Kaiser Insurance participants. Not to call any of the relatives out in the room, but it was a primarily Caucasian study. And so in that study, they found that 1 to 3 scores were common, and this was a Caucasian population. When I performed this study in tribal communities, my peers are 8 and 9s. Those 8 and 9s have direct correlations with risky behavior, teenage pregnancy, diabetes, heart issues, asthma. And so if we look at all of these things, chronic obesity, all of these disparities that hit us, in order to build these systems, we have to have those positive relationships, those opportunities for a community, because We know now that you can pass this trauma down to the next generation. You may be carrying something that is from your great grandma. And so in order to change this, to build back these systems, you have to heal those things. And that's an integral part of housing.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Talk about that all day.
I know, right? You touch bases on everything. So, in envisioning a more equitable future for housing, what role do you see historical education and awareness playing in promoting a fairer and more just housing system? And how can we engage the broader public in understanding and addressing the legacy of these policies? I know you mentioned that you were not subjected to share this information, but you feel that the community should know this information. Like, what steps could we do in the community to like have this information readily available, accessible, and to be able to use to advocate for real change and hold accountability?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, a really important question. And I think it, when we start thinking about how we want to engage, really, I was in the lived experience panel, and I think that one of the themes that really resonated with me was the fact that, whether it was the youth council or whether it was the lived experience council board, the fact that you are getting people who are on the front lines of these issues at the decision-making table is so critical. And so I think, in terms of the education, part of the education, I think, is how do we get it out in a way that activates folks, right? Gets folks motivated, just like what I was talking about earlier about that big table that we need a bunch of people at to try to solve this problem. How can we make sure that we're leveraging this information that we have to get folks to those tables so that we are building not just relationships, but transformational relationships? I think for a lot of folks, it's, the kinds of relationships that we have with stakeholders or with residents or with the folks that we work with. I work for the county. A lot of those relationships are like transactional, right? Like we have contracts, we have, policies, we have, but how do we deepen those relationships so that they're transformational relationships, right? We're building a broad collaborative coalition of folks so that the folks who are on the front lines of these issues are aware of what's going on, are aware of what has happened in the past, and are bringing their lived experiences to the table so that when we're developing solutions, those lived experiences are informing those solutions, right? Anybody can kind of sit, right, in a meeting room and just kind of say, oh, this is what we need to do, right? But how are we making sure that those strategies that we're actually coming up with are going to meet the needs of the folks that we know, need those solutions, And so I think there's a ton of different examples of how folks have done that. I think, the lived experience committee council is one example of that. I think those are the kinds of things that we should really be supporting and broadening and strengthening.
I'll just say, I grew up in the Central Valley in Visalia, Fresno, Clovis area, and it's a pretty conservative area. I had lots of brown, beautiful Latino friends, Black, Asian, Hmong, lots of white friends, especially when I went to high schools, mostly white, Mormon, conservative friends. And the fact that I can still kind of go back to them and have something in common is pretty amazing because I'm probably about as left as it gets half the time. Conversations right now are really hard, super hard. They see me coming. You're that city guy. You're the affordable housing guy. You're the Chicano power guy, all that stuff. And maybe that a lot of that's true. And maybe it's also true that my white friend doesn't fully understand or appreciate how much privilege they've had. And we have to be able to have those conversations and be able to put the facts on the table and say, these are the facts. Let's understand them and move on. But we have to put them on the table and understand them Because if folks are not willing to understand and appreciate the intense privilege that generational wealth offers you, and then the next conversation, we're talking about inclusionary housing, and you don't even want to entertain that because that's an affront. That's a tax. That's too hard. That's going to be too costly. That's not business friendly enough. Well, I'm sorry, but we've had a couple hundred years worth of inequity to deal with. So let's figure out something to move us forward so that we're not having the same damn conversations all the time. So I reach out to my white brothers and sisters and say, please work with us, work on understanding your white privilege, right, in these conversations, because this is not necessarily just a sociology class discussion anymore. This is a real life situation. We got to get out of the educational moment phase and into the implementation, but we need you here with us.
Yes. Oh my God. Oh, I know that was a lot to digest. I want to leave some room for questions. Any last minute words before I open it up to questions from?
I think just adding on to what my colleague said is pushing for the use of photo voice as a data, an alternative form of data. Because when we can hear voices, when we can hear stories, you can't deny the human side. But when you put a set of numbers up on a projector, you're no longer looking at who lives behind them.
Well, you know what? I do want to ask one more quick question. Are there any notable successes or lessons learned from efforts to rectify the effects of historical policies on housing progress and systemic inequalities that you all are aware of?
Well, I just want to say that yes, I want to thank the California Coalition of Rural Housing and their former now retired director, Rob, and the team there for their investment in AB 1010, which is the tool that has allowed for my tribal nations to step into the tribal set-asides at a state level.
Here. We're gonna get them to sign something next year. Let's do this. Goodness, not a single no vote. How many? Say,
No.
jeez. I know your heart. There's a lot of successes, right? We're all working too hard. There's too many talented people here in the room, the other rooms and stuff. We're gonna keep getting dubs. Trust me. Unfortunately, they tend to be small, and we got to stack them up, right? Because everything's so dang complicated. We're going to keep getting these wins and learn from challenges, all that stuff. I would say one of the learnings that have happened in the recent years on the housing front, especially for deeply affordable housing, is how much the state has had to come in.
Yes.
Because unfortunately, our local governments have not approved enough housing, have not planned for it, have not invested enough. Those are still issues, even when we have excellent representatives like our supervisor here who's with us today, Alejo, and others who champion affordable housing, who take the hard votes, who help and join forces with organizers and others. But what I've seen and learned is that without the state intervention, a lot of progress would not have been possible in recent years. We actually are forcing the hand of local governments and saying, sorry, you had 30 or 40 years worth of local control and look at what we got, right? You didn't approve enough housing. You didn't approve enough housing to meet the needs of farm workers. We have a need for over 30,000 farm worker units in the Pájaro and Salinas Valleys alone. 30,000. That's how much you need in order to deal with the overcrowded conditions, right? And we know what all that means for our community. And so the state has actually come in and passed several waves of legislation now to where we basically have the tools. It's hard, it's complicated. I'm a consultant, so don't worry about me. I'm gonna have plenty of work to do to try to sort through all these dang policies and projects, right? But there's enough tools now going forward to actually make the big moves, to make projects happen for our community, but it's going to take all of us working together. It's going to take more resources from local, state, federal, and the private sector to come forward and finding those sites, zoning them appropriately, making sure that the community is involved enough so that we all have co-ownership on the solutions. But the table is being set right now, and I'm excited about the future, especially in convenings like this. So I just want to thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you. And piggybacking on what you said, that the successes are small and we have to pile them on top. Well, when we've had this much of inequalities, then your successes are like that. It looks minimal, but they're efforts. So, okay, I want to take it out to the audience if anybody has any questions.
Dude, hey. Just a question. Matt was talking about a lot of the tools that were created for local governments to do more. I think one of the questions I have, and could be for any of the panelists, so often many people go to community meetings, they go to summits like this. What are the tools kind of available for community members, for people to get a better understanding? So oftentimes people can now say the words sometimes even, and it'll sound good, but how do you verify that those tools that are now being created are actually being used so that the big swings are being taken at housing? The big swings are being taken at measures to address equity, and that words are just not being spoken by those who make decisions.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of me wants to say, folks should get involved in, local decision-making processes, right? Like the city of Salinas right now is doing their general plan update, and they had to do their housing element as part of that. I know the city really went out and did a lot of community meetings and listening sessions, and hopefully folks showed up to that and, kind of advocated for more affordable housing and really trying to address. So I would say those are kind of the traditional avenues for keeping decision makers accountable. I always hope that these kinds of convenings and, these kinds of opportunities to connect with folks also sparks folks kind of mobilizing on the outside, right? And, thinking about different ways that at the grassroots level, folks can keep, that pressure on decision makers as well, kind of that inside outside kind of strategy, for lack of a better term. I think really thinking about how to support and work in collaboration for multiple avenues, I think is important. But I'm gonna let my other.
I'll be vulnerable and call it out, is that does your community know how to work in those systems? Mine doesn't. I represent 8 nations, and what we found is that we actually have to create a youth legislative framework so that we're starting with 8 to 14-year-olds that are actually learning how these systems work, how to advocate not only for their bodies, but within these systems for their rights. Because I have 50 to 89-year-olds that have such historical trauma, they won't even tell the doctor no when the doctor wants to put them on a new medicine. So it's a new system for me. And so your question is challenging. I don't see how that works for my communities.
Any other questions? I'm not gonna. There's not enough drinks. Where's the drinks at for this one?
Thank you. My name's Ace. I work for Safe Place, which is a homeless youth program down in Monterey. And sometimes I feel like, I want to give these kids hope. Well, they're not kids, but they're kids to me. 60 years old, but you tell them these services are available, don't give up, you can do it, slogans like that. And sometimes I feel like I'm almost, I believe in that there is hope for these people. I really do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. But sometimes I feel like I'm almost misrepresenting my employer by, repeating the same things over and over. And meanwhile, they're sort of in this holding pattern, as I heard in the other room. I guess what I'm getting at is, what would you say to people that are living in encampments? Like my best pitch, I guess, to convince these people not to give up and to continue to believe that there is a place for them in the housing navigation system. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
I know that's a lot.
Thank you, first of all. And going back to my two littles who are now 6 and 9, when I came to my management position before I moved into my director position, my daughters and I were homeless. And one of the things that we've had to do throughout our trauma and throughout our experiences is to do daily affirmations of, no matter what, we're going to be okay. And from a cultural perspective, we're saying that every day, no matter what, we're going to be okay. And to remind them that not giving up means that they themselves may be the change makers in this generation, that they have purpose, that they are loved. And even if they can't see that right now, you're holding that space and that love for them. And that it could be their generations that are the change makers. And there were days where my girls and I are reciting that every 15 minutes. Okay, crap, no matter what, we're going to be okay. Because when you're in that space of hopelessness and depression, you don't see anyone that's helping you. Your depression is so far deeply rooted inside you that it's easy to be able to not find that hope. So thank you. Thank you for your sacrifice and your work and holding and giving that love to them.
Goes a long way. So thank you. I'm echoing.
You got one in the back.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, we're at time, but of course, we always got time for
Chago. Hey, thank you. Well,
Dom,
okay, Dom.
Dom.
Is that all good, Dom? We're healing. Right on. So, wanted to recognize and thank you, Elizabeth, for grounding. Putting starting with that that chapter, right, of our state history, because in the conversations that I've had with Trustee Aurelio Salazar here, and I know a lot of the efforts that our county supervisor, honorable supervisor here, Alejo, has had in working with our local nations, and and these conversations I've had with Vicente and Matthew and folks here. It was those first 3 years of statehood that there were 9 expeditions, and about regions in each of those expeditions. There was either regions or there were counties, right? And it was shocking to find out that the 2 counties that spent the most money was Mariposa and Monterey County in 1850, 51, and 52 in eliminating our native families. And that speaks to this, to the challenge that Matthew is talking about, creating the spaces, preparing our spaces. And, Hartnell College has done a lot to push and provide spaces in ethnic studies, right, to ensure that, that education is gonna be there. So just wanted to recognize that. and question in terms of what can we we have conversations and tactics and strategies of engagement and pressuring of our local electeds or our state electeds and so forth. I'm curious to see if there's been conversations around pressuring or engaging our local ag industry around paying enough money for our folks to be able to be housed, if that's something that could be spoken to. Thank you.
Ooh. You want some fighting words going on here? Chago, what's going on? Where's my ag friends at? Oh, maybe they're not here. No, we have some ag friends. We love. This is one of the greatest agricultural communities on the planet. Very few other concentrated areas like ours can boast over $8 billion, right? This is our number one trade here. It's what we're known for, the salad bowl. A lot to be proud of, a lot to hold accountable, right? From climate change to paying wages to partnerships. One block away, we got one of the biggest, baddest, partners, and in Taylor Farms. It's totally starting to revamp what we know of downtown Salinas. A lot there to unpack. On the housing front, I'm gotta tell you, it's been super challenging because most of the ag folks that I've been talking to for years now, very concentrated on their business operations. They're business folks. They're landowners. They've been at it for generations. And so it's hard to change anything or ask them to do something that's outside of what they know. Housing's one of the things that they don't know very much of. And so just in recent years, it's the thing has been addressing the needs of their workforce. In our area, in Monterey County especially, we've led the country. Supervisor Alejo knows this, in approving the number of beds that ag industry has funded, right? They have funded on their own properties over 2,000, almost 3,000 beds now to meet the needs of their workforce, our workforce. So it's a good thing. And however, it doesn't address a lot of the needs. The biggest need of the community is for the needs of our homeless youth that we learned about, seniors, farm worker families. The farm worker study just a few years ago very clearly said the biggest need in our region here is to meet the needs of farm worker families. So if what they're doing doesn't meet that need, then it's helpful, but it's not addressing the biggest need of our community. And it is helping reduce the homelessness situation because every bed matters, right? These are H-2A workers that would otherwise be taking more motel units off the market or overcrowding our conditions even worse. And yet the need is still there.
Thank you guys so much for this entire panel, all your discussions. And thank you guys we went over, so I'm gonna have to cut this like 86, but thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.